Welcome to Module 3 in PCC's 240M, and we are now in Chapter 4 in our hands-on Microsoft Windows book. We're going to look at a little bit of Active Directory and account management. So let's take a look at Active Directory. It's a directory service that houses information about everything. So you could have users, you could have computers, you could have printers, you could have all these different things, groups and policies. All of that is part of Active Directory. And it's responsible for providing a central listing of resources. So it gives you a centralized location to list all of your resources, but also to manage them as well. So Active Directory is used to manage accounts, groups, and many more network management devices. Domain controllers. So the first way you get started by creating Active Directory is by creating and installing your first domain controller, which we did in Module 1. So servers that have the Active Directory Domain Services role installed, they are domain controllers. Anything that's not a domain controller but is a server that's a part of Active Directory is called a member server. So they don't have Active Directory installed, but they are full members of Active Directory. A domain is a container that holds information. Now, the name of our domain is widgetllc.internal. So this is a container that contains all the objects that we put into it: computers, users, groups, etc. So Microsoft's Windows Server 2016 takes advantage of something called multi-master replication. And that's where every domain controller is equal to every other domain controller. Now, this started in Windows Server 2000. Prior to that, you had a primary domain controller and a backup domain controller. So if anybody still calls it a PDC or a BDC, either they've been in this business too long or they don't understand that we no longer do that. So you feel free to correct them. Multi-master replication basically means that every domain controller is exactly the same, with the exception of these 5 master roles, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it means that they can all replicate with each other. They all have the same rights and capabilities. Active Directory is built to make replication efficient. So when you install 2 domain controllers, by default, it sets up replication with each other, and they just start replicating. You don't have to do anything to get it to happen, although you can certainly force it to happen sooner or more often in case you need to maybe retire an old domain controller, but the replication will start all on its own if you don't do anything. There's the Active Directory schema. This defines the objects and information pertaining to those objects that can be stored in Active Directory. This is, I think of this as sort of the framework of the building, is schema. So you have one of the master roles that is in the Active Directory domain is going to be the schema master. So the schema master means, hey, you cannot build a new room, you cannot take anything away without the schema master being there. So if the schema master is down, yeah, you can add a new user, add a new computer, but it won't get replicated to everybody else in the domain and be officially part of the domain until the schema master gives it its blessing. So it is very much an important part of Active Directory itself. Without it, it's just a mess on the floor. So user accounts. This is a class of object in Active Directory that is defined through schema elements unique to that class. So we'll talk about that coming up. Global catalog. This stores information about every object within the forest. So you need to have a database location that says all these computers are members of the domain. All these users are members of the domain. And you need to be able to make that searchable. Well, a global catalog does that. And by default, the first domain controller, it holds all 5 master roles, and it is a global catalog. So you have to have at least one server that does both of those things. The first DC configured in a forest becomes the GC, as I mentioned. And every other domain controller you install, by default, also becomes a GC or global catalog. If you uncheck the box to be a global catalog, then that will take that role away. However, like I said, you have to have at least one, and preferably 2. Because if you don't have one, then you've lost all of your objects. They've all fallen out of the bucket. Active Directory uses domain name system to do name resolution. We talked about that in the previous module. And it uses a namespace, which is a logical area on a network that contains directory services and named objects. So we have what's called a fully qualified domain name in our Windows Server Active Directory, and it's called widgetllc.internal, but the the first domain controller is DCO1, right? So its fully qualified domain name is dco1.widgetllc.internal. Active Directory employs two kinds of namespaces: a contiguous namespace, one in which every child object contains the name of the parent object, and a disjointed one when the child name does not resemble it. So what does that mean? Well, as I mentioned before, widgetllc.internal, that is our namespace to start with. So if I were to create a child domain and I called it child.widgetllc.internal, that would be a contiguous namespace because it uses the parent name and it adds a child at the left-hand side. Everything goes from right to left. Now, a disjointed namespace is when it does not have the name of the parent. So if I were to call it, child.widget2.internal, then it would be what's called disjointed. Active Directory has a tree-like structure. So as you can see in the graphic here, you start out with the forest. So your first domain controller creates a forest and a domain. It also creates one branch of a tree. So it can get kind of complicated. So let's just take a look at this the way it looks now. We see the forest, we see a tree, we see two domains. We're only going to have one domain. And it sees these organizational units. So we're going to talk about those OUs here shortly. So in our case, we just have a forest, a tree, and a domain. And it's all one because we have not made ours that complex to start with. But a forest consists of one or more Active Directory trees. It's like an inverted tree. It's like, flip the tree upside down. So forests have the following characteristics. Tree you can use a disjointed namespace if you want. All trees use the same schema, use the same global catalog, and domains enable administration of commonly associated objects. And it has what's called a two-way transitive trust. So what does a transitive trust mean? Well, if domain A trusts domain B, and domain B trusts domain C, then by default, a transitive trust says A and C will also trust each other. That's transitive. You didn't have to specifically spell it out, but it happened anyway. All right, so here we have another picture of a forest. We have partsplus.com, Toronto, Montreal, and Detroit. And then we have these other domains, which are going to be disjointed in here, but they're all still part of the same forest. So that's another way of doing things. So I mentioned earlier OUs, organizational units. Keep those in mind. So this is a way to achieve more flexibility. So basically, every object is going to be either in an OU or a folder. So what's the difference? Well, an OU allows you to apply group policy to any of the objects in it. A folder does not. A folder is just a storage place. So if we have an OU where I want to set up group policy, let's say we want to set up a group policy that hides the control panel from all of the users. So we don't want people to go into the control panel. We don't want them to mess anything up. So we go and we hide that in group policy. We apply the group policy to all the objects in that OU. And then any user or computer that logs into the domain where that group policy applies to them, the control panel will be gone. And that may be what we want to do. Or we may want to show a certain background color or a certain web page when they open up Internet Explorer or Edge. So that's the kind of stuff that group policy does, and it does it by applying it to anything that's in an OU. So when you open up Active Directory users and computers, you're going to see a whole bunch of folders on the left-hand side. If they have a little tiny icon in them, that means they're an OU. If you don't see an icon, that means they're just a folder, which is just a holding place. Nothing can really affect it. So when you plan to create OUs, keep 3 concerns in mind. Microsoft limits you to 10 levels or fewer. I don't recommend you go any more than 2 levels, because otherwise things get really complex and confusing. I once had a company pay us over $10,000 just to undo what the previous IT administrator did because he nested too many OUs together. Creation of OUs involves more processing resources because each request through an OU requires CPU time. So you don't want to go too deep. Now let's talk about sites. All right, so by default, when you create your first forest and domain, which we have done, we created a site, and it's called default site. Not very original, but that's what it's called. So let's say that we create a site. We have a location. Our business is located in 2 places. Let's say Portland and Seattle. Let's say Portland is the main one because we're the better town. And so we have many more employees, and Seattle is the branch office. So we want to put a domain controller in Seattle, and we want to put we have multiple domain controllers in Portland. So we create Active Directory sites for Portland and Seattle. So what's the advantage of that? Well, when the Portland folks log in, they will automatically get a Portland domain controller to authenticate them, which is very quick because it's local to them. The Seattle folks will get a Seattle domain controller. If we don't split those sites up, then what can happen is when some of the Portland folks log in, because of round robin, with every time you log in, you get a different domain controller, you could end up having the Seattle domain controller authenticate you, which could take forever. And so you'll have this long spinning, hourglass or circle, and you won't know why, and you'll think something's wrong. When in reality, it's authenticating, it's just taking a long time. So that's why you want to create sites. So we're going to create sites in one of our upcoming courses, not in this course, but an upcoming course. But it's good for you to know what that is. A bridgehead server is also very helpful. Let's say we've got 3 different domain controllers in Portland and Seattle. By default, they're all going to replicate with each other, which creates a lot of traffic between them and can slow down our WAN connection. So you can create what's called a bridgehead server that says, all right, DCO1 and DCO4 in Seattle will replicate with each other, and then those guys will replicate with their own local servers. So that's a very useful way of using a bridgehead server to cut down on WAN traffic. Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Azure is the cloud services for Office 365, for creating virtual machines and things like that. Well, you can now synchronize your on-premises Active Directory in your business or wherever to a domain controller or whatever, Office 365, in Microsoft Azure. So what that does for you is, let's say your email is being hosted in Azure because you don't want to deal with Exchange servers anymore, but your Active Directory is on site. So when the users go to log into Windows and then they open up Outlook, if you don't have this Active Directory sync happening, they'll get prompted for another username and password logon when they open up Outlook. But by creating Azure Active Directory sync, they won't do that. It'll automatically synchronize your on-premises Active Directory to your Office 365 Active Directory. So very nice to have. All right, here's a little picture of Azure at the top, and you have a picture of your on-premises, and then you have the groups and everything is synchronized between the 2 locations. User account management. By default, on Server 2016, you have an administrator and a guest account. Now, you have the same thing in Windows 10, an administrator and guest account, but those are both disabled by default. You can enable them, but it's not recommended. It could be a security risk. The guest account does not have any any password on it by default. So it comes disabled. If you enable it, then any resource like a shared folder that has the everyone group allowed, the guest can now access that. So you don't really want to enable this guest account for that very reason alone. And of course, you don't want to have the everyone group have access to anything. The administrator account in Windows Server 2016 is enabled, unlike Windows 10 where both of those are disabled. On Server 2016, only the guest account is disabled, but administrator is enabled. And you use that to manage your domain. When Active Directory is installed and the server is a domain controller, we use Active Directory users and computers to manage Active Directory. There's other tools as well, such as the Active Directory Administrative Center, which we'll talk about in another course, and you can also manage it with PowerShell. But the simplest program is Active Directory users and computers, and refer to that application as ADUC. So if you ever hear me say, or one of the other instructors say ADUC, that's what that is. So enabling, disabling, and renaming accounts. When we imported all of our accounts using the CSVDE command tool, what that did was it brought in all these different accounts, but they all came in disabled. So you need to enable the accounts in order to use them. So if you go into ADUC, you can right-click on a user or a group of users or a group of computers, and you can enable them, or you can also disable them. So there's lots of different reasons for enabling or disabling an account, such as a user taking a leave of absence. So when an employee moves from one department to another, you can move that person's account from one OU to another OU if you'd like as well. And that way group policies that apply to that other OU will affect them rather than the department they used to be in. You can reset a password in ADUC simply by right-clicking on the user and choose Reset Password. Couldn't be simpler. And by default, by the way, you're going to have to reset your administrator password for Active Directory. So it's only going to be good for about 2/3 of the class. And then it's going to force you to change your password. So what I recommend is you go in and you double-click on the administrator account and you go into the account tab and then you change so the password never expires. Deleting an account. You want to delete accounts that are no longer in use. However, when a user leaves, they may have rights to things that you may want to see before that user, before that user is deleted. So you can right-click on it and choose Disable until you get all the information you need for the next employee taking their spot, and then you can go and delete that account. One of the best ways to manage accounts is by grouping accounts that have similar characteristics. Types of groups: local, domain, global, and universal. All right, so what this means is, let's say we have a shared folder, and this shared folder is used by the accounting group, and the accounting group has 100 people in it. So if I go into the shared folder, I would have to add individually all 100 people. And anytime anybody leaves, I'd have to go into that share and delete or re-add people as needed. Now, what if they had 10 shares? Then I'd have to do this 10 times. That's a real problem. So Microsoft has what's called security groups. And these security groups allow us to add or delete users one time in the group, and then we add that group to share the shared folder permissions, or those 10 shared folder permissions. And then it's much easier to manage, add, and delete users. Now, there's different types of groups. There is a local group, which would be local to a computer that's not a member of a domain. Just forget about that one for now. You have domain, local, global, and universal. So domain local is if you have, you want to give rights to just the domain that you are in. Global is, let's say you have 2 domains. Well, if you create a global group, it affects both domains. So Widget LLC 1 and Widget LLC 2. So anybody in there you could add access to. And universal is if you have more than one forest. So let's say Widget LLC 1 is a company and Widget LLC 2 is a company. They have completely separate forests and they merge together. So you want to have these forests and their domains underneath it available to all of their users. So you create what's called a universal group, which traverses both forests and all of their domains. So that should cover all the different types of access for the groups. Now, there's 2 different types of groups also on the right-hand side when you go to create a group, and it gives you the option for a security group or a distribution group. So a security group is exactly what I was just talking about. So you can add to a folder share, so you can share that with people. Distribution group is if you have an email server, an Exchange server. You want to create a distribution group to send emails to all of those folks all at once. So other than that, distribution groups really aren't used. So if you don't have an Exchange email server, then you can just ignore that altogether and just create security groups. Domain local security groups used when Active Directory is deployed. As I mentioned, it's just the domain that you're in. Global groups, as I mentioned, it's when you have multiple domains, so we covered that already. And universal is when you have multiple forests. So here's what a picture looks like with a universal group, just to give you an idea. Let's say we've got college.edu, students.college.edu, and research.college.edu. So those are multiple different, in this case, domains, but they could also be multiple different forests as well. So this universal group will give access to all 3 of these domains, even though domains is spelled wrong. 5 important or new features deserve particular mention. You've got restart capability, read-only domain controller, and other things here. So let's take a look what that is. Restart capability provides the option to stop Active Directory and restart it again. Couldn't do that in older versions. You could do it in 2012, but you couldn't do it in older versions of Windows Server. So that's really helpful because in times past you had to restart the entire server if you made certain changes to Active Directory. Another thing that's come out is the read-only domain controller. So this is great for remote offices where you don't have an IT administrator on site and you don't want anybody to make any changes to it. So you send this read-only domain controller so users can authenticate themselves to a local domain controller, so it's fast for them to log on. However, no one can go in and make any changes to it. The replication is one way, from the parent to that read-only domain controller. 2012 R2 also introduced the ability to clone domain controllers, and this is also available for 2016. So you can cut down on a lot of the steps required to create additional virtual domain controllers. Fine-grained password policy enhancement. Different security groups can have different password policies. So Windows has the ability, using group policy, to go in and say, give different password policy requirements to each different group in an OU. So for instance, if I said the IT group needs to have a much higher password policy because they have many more rights and it just makes the network more vulnerable, then we could say the IT group has a 12 password minimum. We can say the admin team has a 7 password minimum because they don't have many rights, and if they get hacked, it's not as important. Protected users global group. This enforces strict locked-in security and protection measures that cannot be reconfigured. The only way to change the security for a member of this group is to remove the member from the group. So user accounts, computers, printers, and servers can also be members. All right, we talked a lot about Active Directory and what it means. So you installed Active Directory in your first lab. However, you may not have known the reasons why you were doing certain things. And hopefully this cleared up a lot of those reasons, which sets us up for some of our upcoming labs. So that does it for Module 3. You can go ahead and click on any mini videos that you need inside the lab instructions, and we'll see you in Module 4.